Okay, even if I hope that more people is coming, let's start. Let me introduce you to Björn Schuller from the Technical University of Munich. He's going to speak about speaker state and trait analysis. He's an expert in this topic, and I think that you should keep an eye on him because he is the state of the art. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice and efficient introduction. And welcome everybody. So in fact, he just told me that in the program it says states and traits, not only one state and one trait, so we're talking about several in fact. And we'll talk about analysis of these. But just one practical question: has anybody seen this in any tutorial or similar before? Say at ICAS for interspeech? No? Okay. Yes, you, sort of. Okay. So I hope I'm not boring anybody. So we will talk about states and traits and introduce them. And then let's talk a little bit about data, which is quite one of the bottlenecks in this field, so to say. Then acoustic modeling and linguistic modeling. So we will be looking at how something was said and what was being said in order to assess these states and traits. Then also at non-linguistics, so for example, laughter or size and other indications of non-linguistic affect hints. Then multi-X stands for multimodal fusion and multitask analysis. As you might imagine, some of these states and traits are highly correlated and interlinked, so it could be a good idea to look at them in one pass, in a common pass, and not look at them in isolation. Yeah, and then let's look a little bit at applications before we come to the 10 trends. So I wanted to discuss a little bit rather than have a holistic wrap-up about what is hot in the area, so to say, at this moment. And then there would be this practical part, the hands-on part. And I hope you all have the software on the stick. It's not much, in fact. It's a very small binary, 3 WAV files, and we can toy around a little bit with the feature extraction toolkit. I don't know if any of you has something to present or suggest for discussion in this session. Doesn't look like. No, because in theory we said we could also be discussing your current problems, concerns, issues, so nothing to be presented from your side. But you can still, of course, at any time, and you're highly welcome to interrupt me at any time, ask questions, and feel free to clarify things immediately. Also, feel free to raise your hand whenever something's wrong. I'm too fast, too slow, I'm boring you, I'm not audible, or whatever else. Okay, so speaker states and traits. Here you've got the plural now. What are speaker states and traits? So let's first listen to some audio, and it's also a bit of a test if this works. We only got the microphone transmission, but I hope it will be audible.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
So let's listen to it again.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
The laptop's regrettably not very loud. It doesn't really matter. Actually, it was just any speech. And the question simply is, don't look into the slides, by the way, because then you would simply read out what is on the slide. But just say, what did you hear? Pardon me?
There were no pauses between the words.
No pauses. Okay, great. So you heard pauses or not pauses. What else did we hear? Okay, she, so you heard the gender, and she wasn't happy, so you maybe heard emotion, or you did hear emotion?
Or at least, I wasn't sure about the emotion, but at least it didn't seem like positive.
Yeah. All right, what else?
It was highly intelligible.
Highly intelligible, great. So, anything else? Okay, so what could have else been in this? You said gender, emotion, intelligibility, and pauses or not pauses. So usually people, it's funny that you didn't start with that, always say what has been said first, and this is really, the primary concern in the field usually in speech processing, to recognize what has been said, the text. And then there are truthfulness, for example, the role of the speaker, if there was a conversation, was she leading the conversation or not? The level of interest, the emotion, and then also sleepiness, intoxication, health state, relatedness. So, for example, if a mother talks to her own child or to a child which is not her own, the weight even, likability, age, height, intelligibility, and you probably can't read those, gender, personality, ID, ethnicity. And these are just some examples. So in fact, this was a Afro-American woman in the mid-30s, and you could have specified some of these things already from this voice clip. So how to group these, and are there many more? We have two main axes here. One is the time, and this is what we usually group it with in the first place. What does time mean here? The truthfulness, maybe the emotion, are rather short time. Then we have sleepiness or intoxication. If you're drunk, you're not drunk for one sentence, but you're drunk for a couple of hours probably. And then we have very permanent, like personality, gender, of course, and so on. Bless you. Then we have the perceivedness here as an axis. It's not a well-named axis maybe, but I didn't know how to name it. Maybe subjectivity is better. It means how sure are we about these states and traits. And this is one of the major issues in this field, because often we just are not very sure. So we're rather sure about the age, but believe it or not, even in our age database, we have many false age labels, because in particular women, I heard, were not too truthful about their age in the collection sometimes. But then it goes to very unsure. So emotion, for example, we would usually need many raters or labelers. So with going to more and more subjective, we need more and more raters to establish a solid gold standard. Now, gold standard and ground truth are two different things in our terminology. We say that the ground truth is really what you see from the satellite on Earth, and you've got the picture from the ground, and you see, okay, there's this street exactly in this position. Whereas the gold standard we would refer to say what we establish as a sort of pseudo ground truth, because we don't know the ground truth. So in other words, we don't know what emotion really was perceived or felt by this person, but we know the gold standard which we use with several labelers agreeing on this emotion, for example. Now with the time here, we will need more and more speakers, because if you're going for age, we can hardly have a single speaker fake different ages, but we would really need different hundreds, thousands of speakers collected to have a meaningful database. So these are the two main axes, saying how many speakers, how many raters do we need, but there could be, of course, many other axes or labels. I put some here. One would be acted versus spontaneous, and you could add other ones like feigned or suppressed. So, for example, for emotion, but even for intoxication, for example. You could act to be intoxicated, you could feign to be intoxicated, you could try, if you're in a police control, to suppress your intoxication. Then measured versus perceived, felt versus perceived, intentional versus instinctual, consistent versus discrepant, private versus social, universal versus culture-specific, unimodal versus multimodal. So there are many more. We've organized some challenges in the past, and so far we found a new name for every challenge: speaker state, trait, emotion, paralinguistic, and so on challenge. So you can see we mostly went by these time, state, and trait. So the states are short time related, the traits are long time related. Now we're starting to go by the subjectivity, because this year we're having speaker traits which are perceived and not which are age or gender. And there would be many further to go for. All right, but we want to deal with this in the, yeah?
And in the slide when you were talking about the time versus perceivedness, I wonder weight and height didn't really get, can you deduce that from the rate of speed?
Yeah.
Weight and height?
Yeah, actually, we say we want to approach, we don't want to, but we're approaching the transparent speaker, including all these sorts of information. And in fact, height can be determined somewhat very accurately. We will see some results later on where we made 7 centimeter mean linear error. There are some works reporting already 5 centimeters mean linear error. And you can think that it is related to the vocal tract length, which you're using in speech recognition for adaptation purposes. And it seems natural. I mean, somehow, if you don't see somebody, you still have an imagination. Is this a rather, whatever, tall or small person? Mostly correlated, of course, in the first place to pitch, mean pitch, but there are many other indicators for that. And the same goes with weight, because in the end, weight, height, and body surface are sort of linearly dependent. So all of this is responsible for your volume or your resonance room or volume, so to say. Okay. So in the real life, we want to be very realistic. That's what we also feature in the challenges usually. So for the capture, we say we have a single microphone source, it's mono, then it's non-prototypical. And what does that mean? It means that even if it's very subjective, a system has to provide an output for everything that comes in. So we can't pre-select, we cannot say we only look at the ones where 5 out of 6 labelers agreed, because the system simply has to deal with everything. So we're always claiming that you have to be able to process everything. And non-prototypical also means that it shouldn't be too much overdone. So if you think of emotion, and this is always my favorite because I worked a lot on emotion. For examples, you can think that I can be very angry to fake emotion, but then if I'm really angry, maybe it's very subtle rather. And so this is what we mean by non-prototypical, non-pre-selected. Then processing is quite an issue here because first of all we need to think of some chunking. We can think of different ways to chunk the audio. We could go frame by frame, maybe as in phoneme recognition. We could go word by word. We could go turn by turn with an automatic segmentation or with a meaningful semantic syntactic segmentation. But in fact it's very, very different what is looked at. Usually you can say that a suprasegmental representation is better suited for many of these tasks, meaning that you have to have a lot of speech available before you do some prosody analysis. But in any case, it should be done automatic in a real system. So metadata, if we use any, should be retrieved from the web. We'll see examples for that later on. No optimization on tests, should be obvious, independence of speakers. And then we have this real issue of the task formalization. I already mentioned ground truth versus gold standard, and it can be quite challenging to formalize the task. Already for age, you can think of, do I go for continuous? Do I have it as a regression problem? Or do I go for discrete and have classes like young, whatever, middle, old, or senior? And in emotion, it becomes even more challenging. You have to think, do I use discrete labels like anger, fear, and so on, or do I use a space like this, arousal, valence, and you can come up with several further axes like dominance and intensity and so on. Or do I use even complex emotions, attaching a major emotion and a minor emotion? And what you can always try and do is to have it self-learned. So for example, in emotion, we started to use clustering to find cluster points which are more meaningful to the system. In dependence or depending on the data we've seen for this task, because often this can be very skewed. Maybe we have only young people in the database, so it's not so reasonable to come up with an expert young, middle, senior range division, but have it rather clustered by itself. Yeah, so these are just 2 more plots for clustering in the emotion space, so arousal and valence, and depending on the database, it gives you very different cluster points.
But how can you find out that these classes are, I mean, is there a measure to see that?
Yeah, so
You don't have to check it afterwards, or?
if they are meaningful, yeah. So we find them on the training data, obviously, by k-means or whatever, expectation maximization clustering, so by a distance to the neighbor instances. If they're meaningful is a good question, because you can see here some of these cluster points span, for example, minus and plus valence, but it's somewhat close to the origin, so it's somewhat close to neutral. And then some of these are more and less meaningful, but if you think of a system that analyzes input and generates output, maybe it's not even so important if it's meaningful to us, but it can use reinforcement learning or whatever and make itself some sort of sense out of this. We often found correlation to or some meaning that you can attach in the real world, but we're saying it can be interesting even if we can't. However, maybe emotion is a very specific case. If you're thinking of the age range or alcohol intoxication range, it's more obvious that it can be meaningful. Yeah, and another advantage, of course, is we can decide how many cluster points to have, and the system can also learn how many classes are best, because obviously the more I use, the worse results I will get per class in terms of recall. All right, so we sort of thought of what do we analyze, what task do we target. We thought of how to model it, so this is time for data. And what is, again, don't look into the slides, print out, what is your idea, what should a good database be like? So what would we require from a good database? Huge, exactly. What else?
All sorts of data. I mean, since you're analyzing speaker traits and state, it should probably include data from lots of data, small. It should cover all kind of genders and age groups, and then intoxicated. I mean, since that's also one of the traits of speaker, so should probably think it should cover everything.
In fact, and it should cover these and also have labels for these. And surprisingly, almost no data set has different labels, despite having the variety of different ages and so on. So, and we'll see later on one example that this can be very helpful to have several states and traits annotated in the same database. Further ideas? Yes.
If it's task-oriented, it should be very close to the final usage of the system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're planning for some a system that is applied in real life with real users, if you have a database made by actors and it's very prototypical, it's not likely to perform very well in real life.
Right, exactly. So it should be close to the use case later on. Okay, so let's look at what I collected. Of course, quantity is first. It should be huge. There is no data like more data. Then high diversity with respect to diverse factors. Reasonable balanced distribution. And in fact, this can be quite a challenge. In particular, if you think again of emotion, my favorite example, we often collect 90% neutral and only 10% non-neutral. So this can be quite an issue. And of course, same maybe for tired, if you collect data in the car of tired drivers, hopefully you will get only 5% of tired drivers or less. Then the knowledge of the natural distribution, despite being reasonably balanced, but then adequate data, realistic data, ideal capture conditions, intended corruption. So maybe you're already providing different noise corruptions or reverberation settings. Reasonable categorization, this is where it starts to become more interesting because we've seen that there are many different categorization schemes available, for example, for emotion, also for personality, and maybe you can even provide different mappings in these different models. Then we have labeling, unique and additional labeling. Provision of gold standards reliability, so not only the labels, but of course the individual labeler tracks, the reliability, and maybe even some additional perception tests. So how did others judge on the data after it's been labeled by these specific labelers? Then documentation of site conditions, additional perception tests, I said, freeing of the data, and defined partitioning. And I want to highlight defined partitioning because this is hardly done in many of the databases in this field, meaning that you should define a training, development, and test partition or whatever partitioning scheme to be used, be it cross-validation, be it whatever. But in this field, we've seen databases where everybody in a new paper uses another partitioning, and of course, this is not very useful. All right. Then I want to just shortly show 2 examples of database collections. One is the TUM Audiovisual Interest Corpus. We used this one in the 2010 Paralinguistic Challenge. We had 21 subjects. To be honest, we had 42, but we had a hard disk crash, and we lost half of the data, which is a pity. But anyway, in the end, we had 21. 11,000 turns, so they were automatically chunked. Then we had them annotated, the text, non-linguistic vocalizations like laughter, sighs. And then we had to come up with a model for interest, because we were interested in speakers' interest. And we first had 5 levels of interest, from very disinterested to very, very interested, as you hopefully all are. And then we had 4 annotators and realized that 5 levels of interest is way too much, because it's not transparent to the labelers to make a difference between very interested and very, very interested, or totally bored and not so totally bored. So we ended up with 3 different levels of interest, and you can see by these histograms that every labeler had quite a different distribution already of the levels of interest. So what we can do now is, of course, make the majority vote, or we can use a mean or median across the labelers and go to a pseudo-continuum, because with 4 labelers and 5 levels of interest, of course, we only have a pseudo-continuum, and model it as a continuous task and can assess either continuous or discrete interest. And then we can measure the agreement across labelers in terms of kappa here, and see that, for example, labelers 3 and 4 had not so good agreement, but overall it's somewhat reasonable. Another example is the speech in minimal invasive surgery. So we said we want to have very realistic emotion. We're going into a hospital. We're recording the operations of the surgeons. So we recorded 29 operations. Those are 37 hours of speech. Had it again segmented automatically and found 16% of the time we recorded were speech. And then again, we had to think of some emotion model. And always you would start with more than you end up with. So we had some more, but ended up with 5: neutral, joy, anger, impatience, and confusion. And you can see what I said before. We collected some 67% of neutral speech, despite such surgical operations being quite emotional. After all, lives are at stake, and sometimes they're really like, come on, we need to do this now, or something like this. In fact, I can show you 2 examples of an angry surgeon, for example.
Wie schön das geht.
Oh, sorry, this was joy.
Ja. Scheiße.
So I don't know if you should speak German. And here we've got confusion.
Bei uns oder wo? Nee, oder wo? Bei uns oder wo? Nee, oder wo?
So you can see the confusion despite probably the bad acoustic conditions and everything. Okay, so, and then again we had 4 annotators, and we even annotated the noise by type. So we had stationary and non-stationary noise types, non-stationary by scissor, clicks, or events. And this has been quite a substantial labeling effort, but then in the end we didn't do a too good job with respect to collecting the meta information. We could have done more on collecting whatever height and other information. And then you can see this is quite some labor, and we were thinking lately a lot of how can we save the labor, how can we more conveniently reach a lot of data, because for most of these tasks this is really being the bottleneck to get data. One obvious candidate is crowdsourcing, like Amazon Mechanical Turk. We'll talk about that in one special slide. Then data synthesis was a special idea of ours, which we had now patented even for the emotion domain. And we thought if we have human emotion, this is a very prototypical but the most popular database, the Berlin Emotional Speech Database.
Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank. Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank. Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank.
Why not resynthesize or synthesize such speech?
Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank. Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank. Der Lappen liegt auf dem Eisschrank.
And you think this doesn't sound too natural and not too perfect, but in a cross-corpus testing with other data?
great. I'm so happy.
We did this with 6 databases now in cross permutation. We measured that the human speech at 65% roughly is even worse than the synthesized speech at 75% for training. This was a surprise to us because we thought, how come that this artificially sounding speech is even better for training? We were only hoping to get maybe a little improvement if we add it. But the answer is we can tailor it to the specific need. So we can have exactly the same word spoken, maybe even a female voice, maybe even whatever other similarity in acoustics, but only imagine, so to say, virtually speaking, how would it have sounded joyfully, how would it have sounded angrily, and then produce infinite, more or less, variations of that. So first of all, we can produce zillions of varied material, different age, gender, and so on, or we can even tailor it specifically. And then we added human and synthesized speech and got an improvement over both of these. So this is a very interesting approach. We think, actually we got inspired from the music domain, and there it seems more natural. If you want to recognize chords in music, you don't have a lot of material annotated with chords from real music, but you have MIDI music, and then you can use the MIDI in different whatever instrumentation speeds and so on, and can generate material. But it seems to be working with some speaker states and traits as well. Yeah, and then we have labeling with rich data. So this brings me back to the different meta information. So this is, for example, the timid corpus, which was not really intended for speaker state and trait analysis, but recently became popular for that because it has 630 speakers, or even more. I think 630 is the test set, so roughly 1,000 maybe. And you can see the age was annotated, the speaker height was annotated, speaker dialect region, speaker education level, and all sorts of different things. So the idea really is to annotate not only one, but several states and traits in a single database, and then benefit from interdependency of these. So here, for example, we're looking at age recognition in terms of cross-correlation. So it is the continuous age in years, and you can see on average it's mistaken by 5.7 years. But if you look at the age distribution, this doesn't mean too much because all the speakers have been more or less in this range. So the cross-correlation is more meaningful. And you can see if we add side information as ground truth, so we put the real information into the speaker feature vector, like race, gender, height, races, original, timid labeling, and combinations of this, we can see that we can go up from 0.32 to 0.46. Of course, this changes once we have to assess it automatically, but you can see that there's quite a gain in doing or in exploiting other speaker state and trait analysis. And it seems obvious that there is a interdependency of these also if you think of emotion under intoxicated condition or a sleepy condition. Given different personalities, so a more open person may be different in its emotion portrayal than a less open person, and so on. Now, we also looked at this for height. It was not so pronounced for height, and here you can see the 7 centimeters. For height, by the way, the 7 centimeters are way more meaningful because you can see that there is at least some coverage from very small to very tall. And also for gender, not too much of a difference, but still of interest. Then the Amazon Mechanical Turk is probably familiar to all of you. So it's anonymous workers, laymen that you can well pay for via Amazon, and they are asked to do some simple labeling tasks. At the moment, being for Amazon and Mechanical Turk, it's mostly limited to the United States and English data, but still you can think of using the internet. Well, and then let's look at the evaluation measures. As said, I don't know what exactly has been shown the other days here. So whenever I'm totally repeating things, raise your hands and say that I'm boring you. The usual measure mostly used is Cohen's kappa. So Cohen's kappa measures the inter-rater reliability between two raters by having the agreement minus chance level divided by 1 minus chance level. So kappa is between 0 and 1. And this is your agreement probability, the number of agreement cases in the database divided by the total number of instances, and this is your chance probability. All the non-agreement cases summed up and divided by n squared. And this is for 2 raters only. Then you can have Fleiss kappa to have more than 2 raters considered. And usually you say values between 0.4 to 0.6 or 0.7. It depends on the number of classes. It depends on the task, but that's a rule of thumb. Show a acceptable, say, agreement. Usually you won't have much more for emotional personality. And then 0.8 upwards is really very good agreement. Maybe for sleepiness or things like that, you will get rather higher ones. And then you have also weighted kappa. So if you're having ordinal scale problems like the age, that is not discrete classes more or less independent of each other like joy or fear, but you really have a continuum, you can weight it linearly or square weight it to punish or reflect better confusions of the extremes. So you should not have disagreement on one says very young, the other one says very old, but rather confusions within proximity. Then you have Krippendorf's alpha or correlation. Correlation, again, for continuous models. And what is interesting is you can also weight the labelers or the raters by the evaluator weighted asymmetry. Actually, we use this now for the first time in the current interspeech challenge because we had subjective speaker traits, and the labelers are then individually weighted, meaning that you see how much do they agree with the common agreement, so to say. And if they are complete outliers, we're weighting them a little bit less than the other ones. You can say this is maybe not so good an idea because maybe this person has this very special perspective and maybe we should not punish this very special perspective. On the other hand side, it will give you a more consistent model. It will give you more consistent results in the end. And it simply punishes those labelers that are completely off. In particular, if you think of Amazon Mechanical Turk, you maybe have some labelers that simply click yes, yes, no, no to get their money. So this is really the idea mostly behind it. It's not so much to punish the labelers which did a proper job, but have a very different perception. It's more intended to get sort of rid of the I just did my job without caring raters. Okay, and then I said perception tests. So we want to annotate and validate the annotation. So we have an independent test setup. Usually you're only having 10% or something of the data randomly subsampled, where you ask another external group to re-rate the data, and it will be good to provide such a perception test result with the data release as well to give an insight into how reliable is it for other humans. Okay, and by that, let's introduce some important corpora and benchmarks. So what are important corpora? It's very difficult to say that. It's very political to say that. So maybe I should rather call it selected corpora and benchmarks. I've already shown the timid corpus a little bit, which, as said, was not really intended for the purpose, but is now popular because it has this rich annotation, and it allows to do several different tasks. Here are some corpora that I featured and highlighted with some colleagues in this series of challenges. So for those of you who would not know the challenges, in 2009 we started with the Interspeech Emotion Challenge and invited the research community to compare their methodology and approaches on the same data under the strictly same conditions, because as said, usually for the same corpora you would have found 10-fold cross-validation, 5-fold cross-validation, speaker independent, leave one speaker out, and so on. But here we really gave a partitioning. In the first edition we didn't do a perfect job because we only had training and test. We did not introduce development, and surprisingly enough, development partitions were not used a lot in the field in the past, simply because the data is so sparse usually that you're really having mostly cross-validation. This was a rather large corpus. We had 18,000 turns, and you wouldn't believe how many different chunkings exist for this corpus, the V-IBO emotion corpus. Those are children playing with a Sony IBO robot, and they have to run through a parkour with this robot dog and control it by speech commands. And sometimes the dog would be obedient, sometimes not, because it simply always does the same sequence of actions. No matter what the children say, the children more or less only give the signal to do the next action. And by that, well, it provokes different emotional reactions. But the chunkings reached from turn levels, so automatic chunking with 500 milliseconds or 1 millisecond pause at the beginning to the end, over word-based, and then all sorts of different syntactic and semantic chunkings, where we said we have meaningful subunits of a whole turn, like stop IBO, go to the right. So you would have stop IBO, go to the right, but the automatic chunking would do stop IBO, go to the right. And you wouldn't believe how many different annotation schemes exist, because originally there were 10 classes. They were then covered to 4 classes actually in many papers. For the challenge we had 5 classes because we added a REST class so that we dealt with all the data, but said the ones that are completely off the 4 classes that we used in the challenge are a REST class. And then we had an additional mapping, only negative and idle, to have a simpler task. So in the end, we had very realistic conditions because the 51 children are from 2 different schools. So they didn't know each other. The acoustic conditions have been different. They had different socially elaborated behavior patterns and maybe different ways to express their emotion, maybe a slightly different dialect, whatever. And we had 5 classes: anger, emphatic, neutral, positive, and rest. And up to then, in the literature, you would have often read papers saying for 7 emotion classes, we get 80 or 90% of emotion recognition. And this was the reality shock, because the baseline we had provided was only 38% for 5 classes. And the best result on this task up to date is 44%. So the 44% were reached by voting over the best candidates. So after each challenge, we collected the predictions from all candidates or participants and did a voting on the N best teams. And it depended on the challenge. Sometimes 3 best, sometimes 5 best did lead to the best result. But it's one of the outcomes of these challenges. If you want to do the best result, probably the best is to have different engines and vote at the end. Not very elegant solution, not what you would want to have as a practical system, because it costs a lot of effort, but it worked quite nicely. But there are some works at least that got close to this upper benchmark by now. And this is the 2-class problem, negative and idle. Maybe this is sufficient in many applications. One is the call centers, where you only want to have negative customers tracked. And there we got a baseline of 67.7 and a voting in the end of 71.2. And here's an example of how subtle this can be.
Stopp! Stopp! Albo, geh nach rechts.
So the first one here.
Stopp! Stopp! Albo, geh nach rechts.
It's the negative, the second, the neutral, and you see it's not like this, I'm really angry now, but it's way more subtle in the real life. Okay, one last word on the baselines maybe. What are the baselines? Every year we provided a feature set extracted by our OpenSmile open source feature extractor, which we will look at the end of this discussion today, and have a very transparent baseline because the feature extraction toolkit is open source and available. Then by intention we use an open source and available classifier. At this time we had HDK, not open source but available, versus Weka, the data mining toolkit, which gives you many different classifiers, and we use support vector machines so everybody could redo the baselines. And funny enough, many did this. So when participants started to download the data, we often had feedback that they redid the baselines and first had problems maybe because they didn't have the right parameter configuration, and then had the baselines, which is quite nice. And you will see that in 2009 we had only 400, it's a lot already, but only 400 features for the baseline. Now in 2010 we had the Paralinguistic Challenge, 47 hours of speech in the agender corpus and 950 speakers roughly. And you see a clear difference. For the emotion we had 51 children, and here we have roughly 1,000 speakers. This is because it's a trait, and as said, we can't fake different ages or genders, so we really need the speakers in there. those were annotated in 4 classes of age: children, youth, adult, and senior. But we also had the continuous age range, and this is that we needed to come up with a 4-class partitioning, which was driven by Deutsche Telekom, who wanted to use this in their, and actually do use it in test phase now in their voice portal. The dialogue changes if the system thinks that you're a child, to less formal, for example, as compared to if you're a senior. And for gender, we had 3 genders, interesting. We had female and male, but also the child or children gender. And the problem here is, for the children, it's almost infeasible to discriminate their gender at a certain age range. But again, we said we have to deal with all data that is coming in. So if children are calling, we can't say we don't know the gender, but we rather class a children class. And you can see that here we had 1,600 features already. But for the age and gender class task, it was so much data that we had a smaller feature set for practical reasons, only 400, distributed to the participants, but a configuration script to extract the 1,600 by themselves. And you can see the baselines were, again, exceeded by the voting in the end. The best result to date is 53.6% for the 4 classes of age. So it's not like you have to worry that the computer can say, oh, you're 30, whatever. But in the real life setting, this is telephone speech, by the way. So it's, again, very realistic with different settings, one's from landlines, one's from mobile, and so on. And the gender with the 3 classes is 86%, but there, to be fair, if you exclude the children, it's almost perfect. So it's 98 or something. And then another task was the audiovisual interest corpus you had seen before. And there we had cross-correlation for the level of interest and had a 0.4 cross-correlation for the level of interest. Voting was not very straightforward here. Well, you could have taken the average, but we didn't do that for this task. Now in 2011, we went for midterm states or traits, so something that is not too short-term, not too long-term, and had intoxication and sleepiness. The ALC corpus, the alcohol language corpus, has 150 speakers, 39 hours of speech, with real alcohol intoxication. Sadly, it was not us, but the partner university in Munich who collected the data. And they had people that volunteered for this asked, what is your target intoxication? They said 1.6 per mil, for example. And then they had breath alcohol concentration measured, blood alcohol concentration measured, and in the end reached their targets. And we have sober and intoxicated. In the sleepy language corpus, we have roughly 100 speakers, and they had real sleep deprivation. So that study was less fun, I reckon. No alcohol, but they had to stay awake for whatever, 20 hours, maybe even more than 20 hours. And then we had self-assessment. We had the knowledge how much sleep deprived were they, but we also needed 2 additional labelers to label on the data, because it's not as measurable as the alcohol intoxication. And now you can try for yourselves. In the end, we had 2 classes only, intoxicated or not, determined by the legal driving limit in Germany, which is 0.5 per mil. And you can see if this person should still be able to drive. Hopefully you can hear it.
Sportplatzweg 27, Marktgreiz.
So who thinks he should be able to drive? At least someone does, yeah? Okay, so here's the reference.
Sportplatzweg 27, Marktgreiz.
And if you hear them in direct comparison, you can see that the first sample was highly intoxicated at 1.5 or something per mil. And you can see again in real conditions, it's way more subtle than you would assume. This speaker is more obvious. She's also highly intoxicated.
Okay. Frau liegt auf dem Bett, eher bewegungslos, eher schämt sich oder findet irgendwas überhaupt nicht.
And all the same.
Es handelt sich hier um einen Unfall. Der Mensch, der im Arm von der Frau gehalten wird, ist die Treppe hinuntergefallen.
Okay. So it's a little bit low volume, but I think you can hear it. And now here we had quite a difference between baseline, 66 roughly, and the voting, 72. What's interesting is that 2 people submitted perception studies, so they submitted papers only asking other people to judge on the data, including police officers. And these perception studies were very different. One had 55%, so way below the computer, and the other one had slightly the same range like the voting. But interestingly enough, this seems to be one of the few tasks where the computer could actually really be superhuman, based on a lot of data that he can learn from, and the average user doesn't have that much experience probably, because either you're sober and you hear sober people, or you're drunk and can't remember how drunk people sound. No, I don't know. But still. And here we've got sleepiness. For sleepiness, we have the Karolinska sleepiness scale from 1 to 10. 10 meaning you can't stay awake almost. So you're really having extreme troubles to stay awake. And 1 being you're perfectly fine. 7.5 was our 2-class delimiter. So again, we felt that a continuous KSS range is way too complicated or too difficult and made it into 2 classes. So here is an example.
Ich suche die Friesenstraße in Berlin.
So sleepy? No. No. And the reference?
Ich suche die Friesenstraße in Berlin.
And you can see in comparison that the first one was highly sleepy.
Ich suche die Friesenstraße in Berlin. Ich suche die Friesenstraße in Berlin.
And yeah, there are differences, but again, it's not too obvious. So in the end, we had some 72.5 still as the upper limit. By the way, so these data are available, so you can contact the owners of the data and get it and do your own experiments on this. And usually we try to free all the challenge data afterwards. It's not always possible, but most of the times it is. Now this is interesting, and we have a more broader perspective in an interspeech paper in Portland, where we try to have majority voting not only over a single turn, but we say as these are not short term but medium term, we can have it averaged over n consecutive turns. So why look at a single turn if we are having an application, say in the car, and somebody talks to the car repeatedly? We have more than 1 turn to assess the intoxication or sleepiness. And this is the intoxication, and you can see that we fuse or majority vote, simple majority vote over 3 up to 29 utterances, and it goes up from 70 on average up to some 76%, so we're gaining some 6%. And the paper at Interspeech redoes this for age and gender and other permanent, more permanent speaker traits and states, and it's always the same picture in the end, so it's really reasonable to do that. We also looked at different phonetic content, so to say, or speaking styles. This is command and control. This is spontaneous speech, and these are tongue twisters, and the middle bar is always the mean. And you can see that in command and control, people are somewhat sufficiently controlled to say a single command like left, right, or whatever, so that you have difficulties to assess the intoxication. It's better if they're talking spontaneously, or more obvious. And it's particularly obvious if you're looking at tongue twisters. So like Fischers Frisse, Frische, I can't even do it myself, despite by intention choosing a German one. So, and there, of course, once you're drunk, it's getting even worse, and you can assess it very well. Now this year, we have the Speaker Trait Challenge, and we have the smallest corpora ever, with only 2 hours of speech roughly per corpus. At the same time, we're having 3 different corpora, which is new. So far, we only had 2 corpora at max. And we have the largest feature set ever. We brute force 6,000 features. In the last one for sleepiness intoxication, we already had 4,000. And we have a couple of different tasks by that. First is the personality. And in personality, we have used the Big 5 personality model. The Big 5 personality uses openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism, or OCEAN for short, by going by these first letters from these tasks. And you can see there's quite a difference in the baseline depending on the task, because openness we only had 59%. And again, this is above or below average, so only 2 classes. And this time using evaluator-weighted estimator, so weighting the raters differently. And we have the highest number of raters ever, I think, here. I don't remember exactly how many it is, but it's more than before. For example, for the likability, we had 30 labelers, because likability is very, very subjective. And then here for conscientiousness, for example, we have almost 80% baseline, and average for these different personality traits and 68%. So here are some examples. Rather than putting one per dimension, I put an ocean and an ocean negative clip, meaning the first one is ocean positive. So it's open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and neuroticist. And the second one is non-open, non-conscientious, and so on. So.
Depuis les années phares des Zurbriggen, Schneider-West, les pays européens ont manifesté un intérêt croissant pour développer leur sport d'élite.
So you can see again, it's very challenging audio conditions already. It's a radio broadcast transmission, and this time French. So we have also different languages covered in these challenges. And here's the non-ocean person.
Finance a sondé les marchés pour faire ses estimations. Et s'il y a des nouveaux riches, il y a aussi un nouveau pauvre. Tout est relatif. L'ancien patron du groupe pétrolier Yukos ne...
And for example, for openness, you can see that the first one sounded more open than the second one.
Finance a sondé les marchés pour faire ses estimations. Et s'il y a des nouveaux riches, il y a aussi...
And so on and so forth. Now the second sub-challenge is the likability. So how likable or not likable is a person. This is based on the age and gender corpus, and some 800 speakers were rated in terms of likability by 30 people. And this was the most challenging task here, because we only got 59% as a baseline. So it's above chance level, which would be 50% for 2 classes, but it's really a challenge to assess speaker likability. You can see for yourself if you like this voice more than the second one.
Ich hätte gerne die Vermittlung, bitte. Mach weiter mit der Liste.
So the first one
Ich hätte gerne die Vermittlung, bitte.
was rated as above average likability.
Mach weiter mit der Liste.
And for political reasons, I don't say what the second one was. And now we've got intelligibility. And intelligibility was the pathology sub-challenge. So the speakers here are having actual neck cancer, and they underwent treatment over years, and we're having at the beginning of the treatment and at the end of the treatment the intelligibility of these speakers. So here are 2 samples from that.
Maar hij was toch jarig en dan moest hem iets gegeven worden.
Maar hij was toch jarig en moest hem iets gegeven worden.
And despite myself not speaking Dutch, I think you can also get the gist of the second one being, well, the less intelligible one with the many breaks and stops and difficulties. This one was a surprise to us because we had used a very naive approach. We had again just used our brute forced feature space without any linguistic analysis. So not looking at the phonemes that were said, or not looking at what should have been said, only at the acoustics, so to say, and we got some 68.9 for the 2-class intelligible or not. And that was a surprise to us also because in the challenge the better results don't go far beyond that, despite using more elaborate results. But of course, the challenge is still ongoing, so let's see what results will be uploaded. Yeah, and then one for the sake of fun, the Ultrastar database. We thought, why not do this in singing? If we can do it in speech, we can do it in singing. We have real pop music, so Madonna, Michael Jackson. This is very realistic, we say. 516 singers in the Ultrastar database, 37 hours of music. And we have to first isolate the singing voice and then deal with the voice being in a singing state, so to say. So pitch, of course, is a catastrophe because it's really coined by the melody and not by the speaker traits. And then we assessed two class problems, voice or none. So the first one is to find the parts where there is singing. So it's very realistic. We have to automatically assess where the singing is. And that gave some 75%. So it's already very challenging to locate the singing on a per beat level. So 1, 2, 3. For 1, 2, 3, we assess if it's singing or not. And then if it's male or female singer over the song, it gives us even more, but this is on the beat level, roughly 90%. So in the end, we were able to recognize in a real pop music piece from MP3 if a male or female singer is in there. Then if the singer is white or other, this sounds very politically incorrect, sorry for that. Again, we stick with timid terminology, and we had simply issues with the database distribution because the ones labeled as white were by far more present in the pop music sample we had chosen. But still it's above chance level. You could say that there are some genre issues maybe. Maybe it's also impacted by the type of music, but it seems to be working somehow. And then the year above or below 30 years, the average pop singer turned out to be 30 years. Again, slightly only above chance level was 59 roughly, and then above below 175 centimeters. 72 sounds good, but of course it's highly influenced by gender because it's male or female also a little bit. But there have been at least some male singers below 175 and some female above 175. All right. Another challenge corpus, and that'll be it for the corpora, is the audiovisual emotion challenge corpus. It's another ongoing challenge at this moment. We thought, let's not redo the emotion challenge for speech only, but let's redo it for audiovisual. And we had a first issue in 2011 held at the ACI conference, and now we're having a new one at the ACM-ICMI. There we have train, develop, test partitioning, and we have substantial amount of data because the video frames total up to 1.4 million roughly video frames, and that was so huge that we couldn't use it all by ourselves for training. We had to use very complicated bootstrapping mechanisms and train 10 classifiers and do some bootstrapping there. It's 50,000 words, 7 hours of speech, and we have different dimensions here: activation, expectation, power, and valence. And you can see there's quite some correlation among some of these. For example, expectation and power are highly correlated at 35.8%, so to say, or 0.36. And all these correlations were significant, highly significant, in fact. And again, we did some baselines for video by LBPs, for audio with 1.9K OpenSmile audio features. And the baselines were very frustrating because, in fact, for the audio and video sub-challenge, they were below chance level. So in the end, the challenge participants with more elaborate approaches surpassed chance level, thankfully. But it's not way above chance level, so it's a really, really challenging task. And it's completely continuous in time, and now it's also completely continuous in dimension, because in the 2012 issue we did not go for 2 class above below average, but we really went for predicting -1 to +1, the full range. On the audiovisual sub-challenge, the baseline was above chance level, and fusion of modality helped to improve things. All right, from that, again, to what else can we do to save labor? If we have several benchmark corpora already available, why not pool the data, so to say, and use not one emotion database, but say 5, and put the big data together. The first issue that arises is each one comes with its own classification scheme. So one has maybe anger, joy, happiness. The other one has maybe valence and continuous range. So first you will need to find a mapping between these schemes. We usually simply use arousal and valence plus minus to map, for example, joy to plus valence and plus arousal, and whatever anger to minus valence and plus arousal, and so on and so forth. And then you can see 3 lines here per database here. The first one is using 3 databases pooled, and it gives very different results depending on which databases you're pooling together. So the first question would be, can we a priori say which databases would make the best pool, so to say? So which databases fit best together? The second line gives you plus unlabeled 2, meaning that 2 of the databases are used without their original labels, but a classifier is trained on the first 3, labels the second 2, and then they're pooled together to test on the remaining 6 one. And that means we're doing semi-supervised learning. And the plus here is the average, and you can see over the different constellations which of the 5 to take for training and testing. And you can see that the plus often from the adding unlabeled 2 is right of the plus from using arbitrary 3. So semi-supervised labeling gives you an improvement. We'll see for the details afterwards. And the last one is putting all 5 together, which is usually the best. So if you pool all data with all the original labels, it gets better and better. So in short, pooling data seems to be a good idea. Why use only one database and not several if we have the data? And semi-supervised learning seems to be a good idea. So this is the same for valence now, and it's highly different depending on the test database. Sometimes the semi-supervised labeling decreases things. Sometimes there's a huge improvement. So it's very much dependent on the test database, which also shows that it's a good idea to not only use one test database, but rather use several. In fact, in emotion recognition, we're now mostly using 9 test databases. And this is the semi-supervised learning on average. So the label 3 for arousal gives some 62.6 on average, with the adding the semi-supervised learned data, 63.2. Doesn't sound too much of a delta, but it's highly significant. And labeled 5 is slightly above. In other words, if we don't have the labels, we can still do better by still using the data. And this is very interesting because often we have a lot of data available. Think of the call center. We got a hard disk drive with 200 gigabyte of call center speech. Of course, nobody can label this, but the computer could. And at this interspeech, we will present active learning in addition. And that's interesting because it means that the computer shares the labeling effort with the human. It says, okay, I can label this part of the data, you help me on this part of the data, and we don't need this part of the data. So how is that done? This part of the data that we don't need is maybe finding the ones that are too similar to what we've already seen. For example, trying to locate, say, neutral speech first and not emotional. So we have a computer-driven neutral versus not neutral discrimination only. We say, okay, we're interested in the not neutral cases because if you remember, there may be only 10 or 30%, but we really need more of that data to be labeled. And then we say, which data can I label by myself and which data can I not label by myself? And for that, we can use classifier confidences, for example, only use the high confidence cases. Or we can have some consistency rating. For example, if you remember, we have 6 databases here. Why not train individual classifiers on individual data sets and see how consistent are these individually learned classifiers on the new testing one in terms of arousal and valence, for example. So, and then the computer asks for your help whenever it doesn't feel confident enough, but feels that the data would be of interest. And we've shown that this combination can be highly efficient, way more efficient than the semi-supervised learning because it's, well, having some very reliable newly added data and the human doesn't have to label too much. All right, and for the semi-supervised learning, we're not only using the confidences, what we do in this iteratively, meaning that it adds self-labeled data and then redoes it, even on the same data again to get a little bit better and better in labeling the unknown data. So we're having the tasks thought of that we need to handle. We're having a model established how to describe these tasks, be it above, below average, being fully continuous range, or whatever. And we've considered quite a lot of databases and how to gain data in a very efficient way. Time for the acoustic modeling. Any questions so far? Yes.
Very basic question.
Go ahead.
Could you give more details about arousal and valence?
Oh, sure. Arousal is how active you are. So this is low arousal. Whereas this is very high aroused, okay? And valence is how positive you are. So this is very non-positive, and this is so positive. Okay. And there are a couple of further such dimensions like dominance, which are needed because in arousal valence, anger and fear would be the same, for example. It's both highly aroused if you're very much afraid. You're highly aroused and you're negative. And the same holds for anger, of course. And now with dominance, you will see that fear has very low dominance because you're not dominant, you're the afraid person. Whereas with anger, you're very dominant because you're aggressive and you're dominating, okay? And yeah, then we have novelty, for example, as a further dimension to add surprise. So how surprised are you? And then you can have a combination of positive and negative surprise by having the valence dimension and the novelty dimension, or intensity, and you can think of different such spaces. But the most popular ones are the arousal and valence, and the next most popular probably is the dominance, which is often called power as well. Yes?
I have a question about active learning. You said that you were deciding what data you could, you could read of some part of the data because it was similar to something that was already annotated, or what kind of measure are you using to decide on that? Okay,
so for the similarity of the data, yeah. So the one is, as said, the trying to retrieve or to localize the non-emotional and versus the emotional data. And the other one is simple acoustic measures. So, for example, you can analyze the model change to be expected by adding this data point. You can simply see for acoustic similarity how self-similar is it to what you've seen already, for example. And you can do this very efficiently by using whatever, just a Euclidean distance or something like this, and see how similar is it to what we've already seen.
Okay. Thanks.
I mean, in theory, this doesn't need to be very fast because you can have the computer look at the data with some time. Rather than yourself go over 200 gigabyte of speech, you can give the computer, say, 2, 3, whatever days, and then say, okay, I need these 1,000 instances to be labeled. So our idea here is not to be very real-time efficient, but rather to be very efficient in the sense it really asks you only for the ones that are the most interesting candidates.
Sorry, one question. There's been, sorry, I'm not an expert in audio, but there was something surprising for me in one of the slides that you shown with the examples. And would you mind if we could go to the 22, to the second one? The one with, yes. So in the first subject that you showed, the first one.
Audio clip?
Yes, can we listen it again?
Sportplatzweg 27, Marktkreuz.
Okay, and then we had the reference afterwards.
Yes. Sportplatzweg 27, Marktkreuz.
Okay, so for me the point was that I know any German at all, so for me
it's simply an address.
Yes, so then some intuitive concept comes across, which is the context of the linguistic context itself. For me, as a signal processor, as an analyst, the first one was perfect in the beginning. So if I could have listened and heard that in Spanish, I would probably had been able to detect whatever problems or all the features that you're explaining right now. But since it was in German, which is completely unknown for me, it was completely surprising, even after listening to the sample, very difficult to identify that there was a difference there.
It is, in fact.
So then the question of context arises, because
Yeah, this is what we're looking at here, actually, right? Where we say we're comparing command and control versus spontaneous speech versus tongue twisters, and more look at the linguistic side of it. And say we're doing a way better job in looking at tongue twisters than at command and control, because there the effect of being intoxicated is more visible than when you just say an address. So you seem to be able to say an address even if you're completely drunk without too much perceivable difference. Whereas if you're saying, such a tongue twister, does anybody know an English tongue twister? Yeah, like the Fischers Fritze, fischt frische Fische, and so on and so forth. There you're really having difficulties, because it's difficult already if you're sober, but once you're intoxicated, it becomes almost infeasible.
So maybe I miss it. All the labelers that you have there were German speakers, or?
Oh, there are no labelers in this one because we have the blood alcohol concentration measured. So this is one of the rare ground truth examples rather than gold standard examples. And in fact, we did try to fuse the breath alcohol concentration, which is way less reliable than the blood alcohol concentration, with the speech. So if ever you're controlled by the police and you're having a breath alcohol test, it's not very reliable, we figured. But we fused speech and breath alcohol because we thought this might be useful for the police, and it almost didn't give us anything because breath alcohol, again, is way more reliable than speech, despite being way less reliable than the blood alcohol concentration. Yeah, but it really is an illustration of it's very difficult to assess this from the speech. So I totally agree with you, and I think probably it wouldn't make much difference if it was a Spanish address, because it simply is so perfect, so to say. All right, so let's start with the acoustic side of things. All right. So, here is our front-end side, so to say. If you look at the overall processing, we're having the audio capture, then some pre-processing, maybe some speech enhancement or something like this. Then we have the lower-level descriptors, which are whatever your MFCCs or energy going frame by frame, whatever 100 frames per second or something like this. And then in theory, we could go on to the classifier, as you do in speech recognition, maybe do some feature reduction by principal component analysis, LDA or something like that. But what we often do is we do some chunking, as said, to have larger units, not these individual frames, like words or voiced, non-voiced, and so on. And then we can derive hierarchical functionals. So a functional projects a time series of unknown lengths to a single scalar value, like mean or maximum and so on. And then we can, again, of course, go to the feature reduction. We could even be combining information from different time levels. And then, of course, we could do some feature selection, not reduction, meaning that we really select individual features and not map the larger feature space to a smaller one by using all information. We could even generate information in this step by exploring the feature space. For example, considering logarithmic representation or division of band energy 1 by band energy 2 and have a little bit explorative feature search. Then we have the back-end side, where we have the classification or regression, depending on discrete or continuous classes. And let's say we have always an acoustic model from the model learning and a language model, the language model being either linguistic information or simply contextual information, where we model the dependency of an emotion under the context of the previous one. But what we also have is loops back here to the feature selection, so we can have the classifier in the loop, and also to the audio database, where we can label data by the machine, as we've just discussed, and have some instance selection, so that we maybe even pre-select instances which are better or less suited for learning. And then we can, of course, fuse with other modalities. So here we have our output from this modality and have some encoding. Encoding is hardly touched in the literature, but you should have a standard where you encode this in a standardized way, your output information. And we'll see one example for emotion recognition. Now we've already looked at this. These are different ways to segment. We can have a whole turn. We can have fixed intervals, like every second. We could have some syntactic driven, seeing where are acoustic changes or something like this. We could have voiced, unvoiced. We can even combine these and have relative, beginning, middle, end, or something like this, and combine different time levels, so global and relative and absolute and so on. And this is far from being settled. This is just one example where we looked at the interest and looked per feature type, pitch, energy, MFCCs, and so on, at the difference between using, in terms of accuracy, between using frame level information and using suprasegmental information. And this is the gain from suprasegmental over frame level. And you can see that, for example, MFCCs are well modeled frame by frame somewhat for emotion or interest, whereas pitch or energy are very well modeled in a suprasegmental way. This is what you would expect. So for pitch, it's not so interesting what an individual frame has, but it's more interesting the intonation curve seen over a couple of consecutive frames. So let's just shortly talk about the continuous descriptors. We have this segmentation first. We're assuming a constant state or pseudo stationarity. Then, of course, do some windowing, depending on the feature contour type, with a Hamming window or Henning window, for example, for spectral information or time domain information, maybe even a rectangular window. Have some 100 frames per second, so we have frames of usually 20, 30, maybe even longer milliseconds size, but as they do a soft windowing, we have a frame shift of 10 milliseconds. And then we extract a couple of low-level descriptors, as said, like spectral descriptors, energy, or yes?
Question about segmentation. What happens when you have overlapping speech?
From different speakers? Yeah, I'll show an example of speech enhancement and separation. Usually we consider this as a pre-processing step where we try to isolate the speech from the individual talkers. So of course we will need some speaker diarization at first, and then need to separate the voices, and of course we will have artifacts and corruption, but so for the moment we assume that we have it isolated. And then we can derive further low-level descriptor type information by simply adding delta regression coefficients, correlation coefficients, so yeah, deltas and so on. And then we can do some smoothing. Usually there is some simple moving average filter or similar to smooth the information present in this field. So it's not that much as in speech recognition, where you use the individual frame and the exact MFCCs, but you're rather interested in the contour or development over time. This is why a simple low-pass filter is often beneficial, because we're not interested in the outliers. And then we have some typical such low-level descriptors: energy, pitch, zero crossings, harmonicity, formants. There's even a standardized set in the MPEG-7 standard, MFCCs, perceptive linear prediction, wavelets, and so on. And here we have a bit of Roddy Cowie speaking.
If I take my mind off.
So you see laughter at the beginning and then speech. And these are pitch and energy and pitch and so on, different feature contours or MFCCs or low-level descriptors. And in fact, there is not one way to extract, for example, pitch, which is why they're not the least bit of standardized. So if you're comparing pitch and say we also considered pitch, it can be very, very different. Pitch can be extracted in the time domain by determination of the first partial, analysis of the time signal, or simplification of the structure, and then finding a maximum, because in voiced sounds you have the excitation pulse, and then you have a lossy vocal tract, so it absorbs the energy, and you always have the pulse, and then the energy falls down. So you're looking for maxima in the time domain, or you can do it by short time analysis, correlation-based, frequency domain, maximum likelihood, and so on. Usually you're again looking for maxima in the frequency, for example, plane, but there are many, many different approaches to determine these. And there are several others that might depend on one. So for example, jitter, which are pitch perturbations. So how steady is your fundamental frequency, or shimmer, how steady is your energy amplitude, harmonics to noise ratio, and so on. So in other words, if you're saying I use the same feature as somebody else, it can be very different because a very different algorithm has been employed. And there can be several other low-level descriptors heavily depending on this one. So in other words, feature sets can be quite different despite sounding the same, so to say. And we also looked at the influence, for example, for pitch. If you're using perfectly extracted pitch or manually corrected pitch versus automatically corrected pitch, and we found some roughly 6% erroneous pitch instances in the VIBO corpus that was used in the emotion challenge. And the most typical error here is the octave error, so that the pitch is assumed 1 octave below the actual pitch octave. It has been children in the database, so they have often been assumed an octave too low. And then some voicing errors, so it was assumed to be unvoiced, but it was voiced, or the other way around. Yeah, and doesn't store, yes, it says it here. So in the automatic system, that made a difference between using perfect or manually corrected pitch and automatically derived pitch of 2%. Doesn't sound too much, but it's significant. And if you think you're having several such unreliable descriptors in there, like formants and so on, and others depend on this, like jitter and shimmer depend on this, it does make a difference in the end if you're having a better or less good extractor implementation. Well, this is just one example of standard, the MPEG-7 LLD. It's a standard, sounds like very standardized. It has all sorts of mostly spectral descriptors, but again, the standard doesn't say how to extract these. It only roughly describes what should be inside, so it still can be very different. So this led us to code OpenSmile, the open speech and music interpretation by large space extraction. A feature extractor to have a very standardized toolkit, because if you use this toolkit, of course you have the same implementation because you're using the same toolkit. And then it allows to define standardized feature sets by saying you're exchanging the configuration file, you have the same set of 1,000, 2,000, whatever features. So OpenSmile is what we will have a look at the end, but the basic principle is that it extracts these low-level descriptors, then adds hierarchical functionals, and it's highly optimized for speed, so it does multi-threading, it's memory efficient and fully configurable. And to give you an impression, for 10,000 audio features, it has a real-time factor of 0.02. For 500,000 audio features, the benchmark is 0.03, meaning it takes 3% of the duration from the audio you're analyzing to extract 500,000 features. And this is why we say that real-time is not an issue for the feature extraction. So here is the overall principle of the feature brute forcing. We're having acoustics and linguistics. And from the acoustic side, we're having the low levels here: intonation, intensity, linear prediction, capsular coefficients, formants, and so on. For the linguistics, we say our low-level descriptor is a string, and the string can be the phonemes, it could be the words, but it's basically being a string. It could also be a string of non-linguistics like laughter, sighs, or disfluencies, pauses. Then we can derive further low-level descriptors. As said, we're adding delta regression coefficients, correlation coefficients, and so on. For linguistics, we say we can derive stemmed versions of the string. We're looking at stemming afterwards. Part of speech tagged versions. So for example, instead of saying the sun is shining, we say particle, noun, verb, and so on. So we re-tag the string, or have some semantic tagging. Maybe we already tag it by positive, negative, or something like this. Then we can do some filtering, smoothing, normalization, or tokenization for the linguistics. For example, we tokenize into single words or into n-grams or character n-grams, whatever. And from here we could actually classify. So if you have your HMM or whatever, you could go into the classifier and classify. But as said, often it's better to look at a suprasegmental, larger amount of audio perspective. So we chunk, absolute, relative, and so on. We have looked at all these, and then apply the functionals. Extremes, means, percentiles, higher moments, peaks, segments, regression, even spectral. So for example, the 5 DCT coefficients from the pitch low-level descriptor or something like this. For the linguistics, we have, for example, vector space modeling. So we look at how often does word X appear in the test phrase and have a single feature per word, lookup tables or statistical functions like salience, information gain. Then we derive, again, if you want to, so like hierarchical. We're not only using the means and the extremes, but maybe the mean of the extremes or the extreme of the means and so on. So you can now imagine how you're coming up with 500,000 audio features if you wish for. We can also do cross-LLD. So for example, the mean of low level of MFCC 1 divided by the mean of MFCC 2 and so on. And do this filtering once again on the function level. So of course we don't want to recognize audio with 500,000 audio features, but we want to have a broad basis to select from for the right ones. Okay, let's call it not a day, but let's call it the first part of this discussion, because it's past and coffee break time. And far as I know, we restart at 11. So enjoy the coffee break. We need to think of some chunking. We can think of different ways to chunk the audio. We could go frame by frame, maybe as in phoneme recognition. We could go word by word. We could go turn by turn with an automatic segmentation or with a meaningful semantic syntactic segmentation. But in fact, it's very, very different what is looked at. Usually, you can say that a suprasegmental representation is better suited for many of these tasks, meaning that you have to have a lot of speech available before you do some prosody analysis. But in any case, it should be done automatic in a real system. So metadata, if we use any, should be retrieved from the web. We'll see examples for that later on. No optimization on tests, should be obvious. Independence of speakers. And then we have this real issue of the task formalization. I already mentioned ground truth versus gold standard, and it can be quite challenging to formalize the task. Already for age, you can think of, do I go for continuous? Do I have it as a regression problem? Or do I go for discrete and have classes like young, whatever, middle, old, or senior? And in emotion, it becomes even more challenging. You have to think, do I use discrete labels like anger, fear, and so on, or do I use a space like this, arousal, valence, and you can come up with several further axes like dominance and intensity and so on. Or do I use even complex emotions, attaching a major emotion and a minor emotion? And what you can always try and do is to have it self-learned. So for example, in emotion, we started to use clustering to find cluster points which are more meaningful to the system. In dependence or depending on the data we've seen for this task, because often this can be very skewed. Maybe we have only young people in the database, so it's not so reasonable to come up with an expert young, middle, senior range division, but have it rather clustered by itself. Yeah, so these are just two more plots for clustering in the emotion space, so arousal and valence, and depending on the database, it gives you very different cluster points.
But how can you find out that these classes are, I mean, is there a measure to do that?
Yeah, so if they are meaningful, yeah. So we find them on the training data, obviously, by k-means or whatever, expectation maximization clustering, so by a distance to the neighbor instances. If they're meaningful is a good question, because you can see here some of these cluster points span, for example, minus and plus valence, but it's somewhat close to the origin, so it's somewhat close to neutral. And then some of these are more and less meaningful, but if you think of a system that inputs, analyzes inputs and generates speaker state, trait, emotion, paralinguistic, and so on challenge. So you can see we mostly went by these time, state, and trait. So the states are short time related, the traits are long time related. Now we're starting to go by the subjectivity, because this year we're having speaker traits which are perceived and not which are age or gender. And there would be many, many further to go for. All right, but we want to deal with this in the, yeah?
And in the slide when you were talking about the time versus perceivedness, I kind of weight and height
Yeah, yeah. Actually, we say we want to approach, we don't want to, but we're approaching the transparent speaker, including all these sorts of information. And in fact, height can be determined somewhat very accurately. We will see some results later on where we made 7 centimeter mean linear error. There are some works reporting already 5 centimeters mean linear error. And you can think that it is related to the vocal tract length, which you're using in speech recognition for adaptation purposes. And it seems natural. I mean, somehow, if you don't see somebody, you still have an imagination, is this a rather, whatever, tall or small person? Mostly correlated, of course, in the first place to pitch, mean pitch, but there are many other indicators for that. And the same goes with weight, because in the end, weight, height, and body surface are sort of linearly dependent. So all of this is responsible for your volume or your resonance room or volume, so to say. Okay. So in the real life, we want to be very realistic. That's what we also feature in the challenges usually. So for the capture, we say we have a single microphone source, it's mono, then it's non-prototypical. And what does that mean? It means that even if it's very subjective, a system has to provide an output for everything that comes in. So we can't pre-select, we cannot say we only look at the ones where 5 out of 6 labelers agreed, because the system simply has to deal with everything. So we're always claiming that you have to be able to process everything. And non-prototypical also means that it shouldn't be too much overdone. So if you think of emotion, and this is always my favorite because I worked a lot on emotion. For examples, you can think that I can be very angry to fake emotion, but then if I'm really angry, maybe it's very subtle rather. And so this is what we mean by non-prototypical, non-pre-selected. Then processing is quite an issue here because first of all,
Okay, even if I hope that more people is coming, let's start. Let me introduce you to Björn Schuller from the Technical University of Munich. He's going to speak about speaker state and trait analysis. He's an expert in this topic, and I think that you should keep an eye on him because he is the state of the art. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice and efficient introduction. And welcome everybody. So in fact, he just told me that in the program it says states and traits, not only one state and one trait, so we're talking about several in fact. And we'll talk about analysis of these. But just one practical question. Has anybody seen this in any tutorial or similar before? Say at ICAS for Interspeech? No? Okay. Yes, you, sort of. Okay. So I hope I'm not boring anybody. So we will talk about states and traits and introduce them. And then let's talk a little bit about data, which is quite one of the bottlenecks in this field, so to say. Then acoustic modeling and linguistic modeling. So we will be looking at how something was said and what was being said in order to assess these states and traits. Then also at non-linguistics, so for example, laughter or size and other indications of non-linguistic affect hints. Then multi-X stands for multimodal fusion and multitask analysis. As you might imagine, some of these states and traits are highly correlated and interlinked, so it could be a good idea to look at them in one pass, in a common pass, and not look at them in isolation. Yeah, and then let's look a little bit at applications. Before we come to the 10 trends. So I wanted to discuss a little bit, rather than have a holistic wrap-up about what is hot in the area, so to say, at this moment. And then there would be this practical part, the hands-on part. And I hope you all have the software on the stick. It's not much, in fact. It's a very small binary, 3 WAV files, and we can toy around a little bit with the feature extraction toolkit. I don't know if any of you has something to present or suggest for discussion in this session. Doesn't look like. No, because in theory we said we could also be discussing your current problems, concerns, issues. So nothing to be presented from your side. But you can still, of course, at any time, and you're highly welcome to interrupt me at any time, ask questions. And in the first place, what does time mean here? The truthfulness, maybe the emotion are rather short time. Then we have sleepiness or intoxication. If you're drunk, you're not drunk for one sentence, but you're drunk for a couple of hours probably. And then we have very permanent, like personality, gender, of course, and so on. Bless you. Then we have the perceivedness here as an axis. It's not a well-named axis maybe, but I didn't know how to name it. Maybe subjectivity is better. It means how sure are we about these states and traits. And this is one of the major issues in this field, because often we just are not very sure. So we're rather sure about the age, but believe it or not, even in our age database we have many false age labels, because in particular women, I heard, were not too truthful about their age in the collection sometimes. But then it goes to very unsure. So emotion, for example, we would usually need many raters or labelers. So with going to more and more subjective, we need more and more raters to establish a solid gold standard. Now, gold standard and ground truth are two different things in our terminology. We say that the ground truth is really what you see from the satellite on Earth, and you've got the picture from the ground, and you see, okay, there's this street exactly in this position. Whereas the gold standard we would refer to say what we establish as a sort of pseudo ground truth, because we don't know the ground truth. So in other words, we don't know what emotion really was perceived or felt by this person, but we know the gold standard which we use with several labelers agreeing on this emotion, for example. Now with the time here, we will need more and more speakers, because if you're going for age, we can hardly have a single speaker fake different ages, but we would really need different hundreds, thousands of speakers collected to have a meaningful database. So these are the two main axes, saying how many speakers, how many raters do we need, but there could be, of course, many other axes or labels. I put some here. One would be acted versus spontaneous, and you could add other ones like feigned or suppressed. So, for example, for emotion, but even for intoxication, for example. You could act to be intoxicated, you could feign to be intoxicated, you could try, if you're in a police control, to suppress your intoxication. Then measured versus perceived, felt versus perceived, intentional versus instinctual, consistent versus discrepant, private versus social, universal versus culture-specific, unimodal versus multimodal. So there are many, many more. We've organized some challenges in the past, and so far we found a new name for every challenge. Feel free to clarify things immediately. Also, feel free to raise your hand whenever something's wrong. I'm too fast, too slow, I'm boring you, I'm not audible, or whatever else. Okay, so speaker states and traits. Here you've got the plural now. What are speaker states and traits? So let's first listen to some audio, and it's also a bit of a test if this works. We only got the microphone transmission, but I hope it will be audible.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
So let's listen to it again.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
The laptop's regrettably not very loud. It doesn't really matter. Actually, it was just any speech. And the question simply is, don't look into the slides, by the way, because then you would simply read out what is on the slide. But just say, what did you hear? Pardon me?
There were no pauses between the words.
No pauses, okay, great. So you heard pauses or not pauses. What else did we hear? Okay, she, so you heard the gender, and she wasn't happy, so you maybe heard emotion, or you did hear emotion?
Or at least, I wasn't sure about the emotion, but at least it didn't seem like positive
Yeah. All right, what else?
It was highly intelligible.
Highly intelligible, great. So, anything else? Okay, so what could have else been in this? You said gender, emotion, intelligibility, and pauses or not pauses. So usually people, it's funny that you didn't start with that, always say what has been said first, and this is really, the primary concern in the field usually in speech processing, to recognize what has been said, the text. And then there are truthfulness, for example, the role of the speaker, if there was a conversation, was she leading the conversation or not? The level of interest, the emotion, and then also sleepiness, intoxication, health state, relatedness. So, for example, if a mother talks to her own child or to a child which is not her own, the weight even, likability, age, height, intelligibility, and you probably can't read those, gender, personality, ID, ethnicity, and these are just some examples. So in fact, this was a Afro-American woman in the mid-30s, and you could have specified some of these things already from this voice clip. So how to group these, and are there many more? We have two main axes here. One is the time, and this is what we usually group it with in the first